So we need to keep a record of what we've done. I think it's important to use some kind of written evidence. And this is, for example, is the sheet that is used in my centre. So we've got here the source of normal plasma. We've called it standard here, but it's the source of pooled normal plasma and its lot number, batch number or lot number. We've also got here the batch or lot number of factor VIII deficient plasma. We know that manufacturers make changes from time to time. For example, there have been changes in some manufacturers' deficient plasma where the level of von Willebrand factor is improved. And so we need to keep records of lot numbers so that we can check back to see whether there's any influence of a change over such a lot number change. The person who did the test and the date of the test. And you can also see a number of boxes here. When we come to make the factor VIII assay at the end of this incubation, you'll see that we will use multiple dilutions, so we have the opportunity to store that information. For now, we should record the dilution of QC material that we've used, the lot number of QC. So this is recorded on this sheet, so we know which dilution we used. The printed form said 1 in 10. Actually, that was the previous lot number of IQC. The current lot number has a little higher antibody concentration, so we need to make a higher dilution. Why do we need to do that? Why is that important? It's essential because the more antibody that's present in the patient sample, or the IQC, the more antibody that's present, the greater will be the loss of factor VIII over that 2 hours. More antibody, more destruction, more loss. A lower level of residual factor VIII. But what's been shown by careful study is that the assay is fully quantitative provided the residual factor VIII at the end of the 2-hour incubation. It's quantitative provided the level of factor VIII in that incubated mixture is somewhere close to 50% of its starting point. And I'm now using the term percent advisedly. I do not mean percentage where it's used sometimes interchangeably, inappropriately with international units per deciliter. We're talking about the residual factor VIII in the patient mixtures relative to the control mixture, where we take the control mixture as our 100% point of reference. Whatever remains in the control mixture, we consider 100% residual. It's not exactly the same place it started. It usually drops a little during the 2 hours. It's not 100 international units per deciliter. Remember what went into that control mixture. Half factor VIII deficient, nothing in it, no factor VIII. Half pooled normal plasma. Pooled normal plasma might be 90 international units per deciliter, might be 100 international units per deciliter, might be 105, somewhere close to 100. So that control mixture begins somewhere around at half that level. So somewhere around 50 international units per deciliter. Might be 40, 45, 50. It's not critical as long as it's fairly close to that value. The key is that we want to know in the patient mixtures, have we lost any extra? How much do they contain relative to the control? We don't need the absolute factor VIII concentration, only the relative concentrations. Has it lost extra factor VIII? Therefore, we work in percentage. What is the percentage in the patient mix? Percentage relative to the control. So we know that the assay works extremely well if the level of inhibitor leaves somewhere around 50% residual factor VIII relative to control. And so we really want to construct our initial dilutions in order to create something which will leave somewhere around 50% residual factor VIII. And in that respect, we have an international definition to help us. The international definition: 1 Bethesda unit, Nijmegen and Bethesda the same, 1 Bethesda unit of factor VIII inhibitor inhibits 50% of the added factor VIII in 2 hours at 37. We're incubating for 2 hours. So if the test, or IQC, if it contains 1 unit per mil, 1 Bethesda unit, we will have, by definition, 50% residual activity. And we noticed, others have noticed, it's been reported that the assay works particularly well when residual factor 8 in the end of the incubation is somewhere close to 50%. And that's the purpose of constructing these several different pre-dilutions of the test sample. We're trying to create in one of those pre-dilutions an inhibitor concentration somewhere close to 1 Bethesda unit per mil, so that the residual factor 8 will be somewhere close to 50%. You'll see when we make the plot how we fully quantitate the assay. And again, it's described in some detail in the WFH lab manual. So if the residual factor 8 at the end of 2 hours, if it's close to 100%, it means there has been no additional loss. No antibodies present. 100% residual, 0 inhibitor. This is a factor 8 assay we'll be performing. We know that factor 8 assays are subject to some assay variability. It's not possible to remove that. So if the true level is exactly the same as the control mix, if it truly is 100% of the control mix, when we make the assay, we might get 100% or 95 or 105 or somewhere close to 100, because we know the assay is little variable. So if the residual factor 8 lies between 90% to 110%, we're confident there's been no change relative to the control mix. 0 antibody, negative. We know if the residual factor 8 is below 75, 70%, below this kind of level, we're pretty confident that actually that number truly is different from 100. We really have lost something. But if we get a figure of 85, 88%, how confident are we? Well, then I think we're in a grey area where it's not clear, because we know the assay is subject to variability. And for this reason, there is an agreed threshold of sensitivity. And we'll talk about that in some detail when we come to plot the results. So it's very important to control the incubation period, to time this exactly. And so these tubes are now exactly on 2 hours. They've spent 2 hours in the water bath. Control mixture, pooled normal plasma, factor 8 deficient plasma, no antibody. IQC mixture, same pooled normal plasma, a dilution of the IQC material, and then a series of mixtures. Test the same test sample at different dilutions, incubated with pooled normal plasma. So the question now, have we lost any extra factor 8? Any extra in the patient mix relative to the loss in the control mix? So the first thing we need to do is to remove all of these tubes together from the 37 degrees water bath, and these are now held at room temperature during the period of assay. So we have a control mixture, IQC, patient sample not diluted, neat plasma, patient sample diluted 1 in 2 before constructing the mix, patient sample 1 in 4 before the mix, patient sample 1 in 8 before the mix. So we need to check the levels of factor 8 now in each of the mixtures relative to the control mix. So we can use the control mix to construct a calibration line in the factor 8 assay. This is an equal mix. Half pooled normal, contains around 90 to 100 international units per deciliter. Half factor 8 deficient, completely lacks factor 8, so has around 40 to 50 international units per deciliter factor 8 at the beginning of the 2 hours, some minor loss during that 2 hours. If we were making a full factor 8 assay, and this were a calibration plasma containing close to 100, we might, for example, use 1 in 10, 1 in 20, 1 in 40 dilution. This contains approximately half that concentration, as we've mentioned. We need to take that into account in constructing the further dilutions for the factor 8 assay. So I'm now going to make dilutions 1 in 5, 1 in 10, 1 in 20. So not so diluted as the full factor VIII assay might have been. So 1 in 5, 1 in 10, 1 in 20. These dilutions are constructed with the same assay buffer as used for factor VIII assays. If that's imidazole glyoxylene in the centre for the reagents, that's what should be used here. If it's Auron's buffer, that should be used here. We're using Auron's buffer just now. The plastic tubes to construct the dilutions, these should be the same that would be used for a factor VIII assay. We're working in the water bath just now because we want to illustrate the principles. Of course, these factor VIII assays just now would be very frequently performed on auto-analyzers, and that's perfectly acceptable. There's some advantages to that, improved precision and so on, faster processing, all advantages. But it's perfectly acceptable to perform this test in a water bath for patient management purposes. The precision is good enough, and I think we're lucky in hemostasis testing that that's true, that we're able to do this without expensive equipment. So we start with the control mix. In the plastic tubes, 1 in 5, 1 in 10, 1 in 20. So these contain 400 microlitres of dilution buffer to make a 1 in 5, 900 microlitres to make a 1 in 10, 1.9 mils to make a 1 in 20. So we'll now add 100 microlitres of the control mix to each of those tubes. And each one is mixed. This is used to construct the calibration line. So we need to treat this as though it were a standard now in a factor VIII assay. So 3 disposable glass tubes. These should not be reused. Some centres have tried to use reused tubes by washing. I absolutely recommend against doing that. It's very difficult to do this in a way that really removes all the clot, the factors, and all the detergent used for washing. So it's absolutely false economy in my opinion. It introduces many problems. So single-use glass tubes. In the water bath, I already have a tube containing APTT reagent and a tube containing calcium chloride. And these are exactly the same APTT and calcium concentrations, exactly the same ones as used in factor VIII assays. And since we'll be performing a series of factor VIII assays, one on each of these mixtures, we need to think in advance which is how many assays, how many tubes, which is the volume of factor VIII deficient plasma, and to be sure we have a single pool of the factor VIII deficient plasma for use during this assay. So this contains a mix of 2 or 3 vials of 1 ml, so that this is pooled before starting. So factor VIII deficient plasma. Really important that this contains 1 millibrand factor. This can have an important effect on the results of factor VIII inhibitor testing. So for each of the 3 glass tubes, 100 microlitres factor VIII deficient plasma. Simply warming up to temperature at the moment. Fresh pipette tip. Control mix. Diluted 1 in 5, 100 microlitres, first tube. Control mix, diluted 1 in 10, 100 microlitres, second tube. Control mix, 1 in 20, guess what, third tube. Just warming up to temperature. And mix. APTT reagent, warmed to 37. To the first tube, start the watch, 3-minute activation for this particular APTT reagent. second tube. "15 seconds and mix. Third tube. "30 seconds and mix." So we've added APT reagent, activator, phospholipid. Contact activation is now occurring, 12 to 12A, 11 to 11A. We don't have essentially any calcium present, so at this moment we're simply activating. In 3 minutes, just as we did for the one-stage factor VIII assay, just as we would do for an APTT, add the calcium, record the endpoint. The APT reagent that's used here should be the same one, can be the same one which is used for factor VIII assays. It is useful at this point to make the assay with an APTT reagent largely unaffected by lupus anticoagulant. It has happened, it's not a rare occurrence for patients with, for example, acquired haemophilia, may have multiple antibodies present. Sometimes we've certainly seen patients with both acquired haemophilia, anti-factor VIII antibodies, and in addition, antiphospholipid, lupus anticoagulant. So they can occur together in the same patient. And if we've got lupus anticoagulant present, that could have an impact on the results and clotting times during this assay. And therefore, there is some advantage to using an insensitive reagent, so a reagent with a very high phospholipid concentration. This will minimize the impact of lupus as an interfering substance. Of course, we're performing just now a factor VIII assay. And as you know, there are alternatives to one-stage factor VIII assays, alternative versions of factor VIII. It can be assayed in chromogenic assays, for example. There are a number available. And there are some studies which have looked carefully at the results of factor VIII inhibitor testing to compare use of chromogenic techniques with one-stage assays for determination of residual factor VIII at this point. And in congenital patients, there is, in most cases, good agreement, but it's very clear that there can be some big differences between the inhibitor titers if we use chromogenic assays in patients with acquired haemophilia. So I think we need more data on this before we can make a firm conclusion about whether it's safe to use chromogenic assay in this setting. So 3-minute activation, calcium to the first tube, start a stopwatch, 15 seconds, calcium to the second tube, start a stopwatch, 30 seconds, calcium to the third tube, start a stopwatch. Now we need to observe these mixtures for clot formation. And so now we have a balance between maintaining the temperature of the incubation mix whilst the tubes are immersed, but at the same time we also want to observe in order to record the clotting time. So the recommendation is that this tilting should be 3 times every 5 seconds through an angle of 90 degrees. And that's what I'm now trying to do. So we have a clot in the first tube. Second tube, of course, contains a higher dilution, therefore less factor VIII, and therefore a longer clotting time. Just waiting for the third tube to clot. Lowest level of factor VIII, longest clotting time. So we've now got a clot in all 3 tubes. The nature of the clot is really quite obvious. It's a solid structure. At least it is for most of the clotting times. If we have a very prolonged clotting time at this stage, up to the 120, 130, 140 seconds, then it can be a much weaker endpoint. But even then, I think it's clear that a clot has occurred. So we need to record the clotting times. So for the first 1 in 5 dilution, 63 seconds. For the 1 in 10 dilution, 69.5 seconds. And for the 1 in 20 dilution, 76.2. So later we'll be using those clotting times to construct a calibration line on the graph paper. We'll come to that a little bit later. So that's the control mix.